In today's reading assignment, you read about structural homology, which is comparing similar structures in different species. And they showed you basically like arms or wings of different kinds of creatures. And these similarities were supposed to be evidence that they all had a common ancestor. And as you read in your book, this has now become evidence against macroevolution because these similarities aren't even coded for in the same place in creatures' DNA. They're on completely different chromosomes. There's no way that they could have been passed from one creature to another based on how these things are coded for within the DNA. It seems to me that we see these similarities in these creatures not because they had a common ancestor, but because they had a common designer. I mean, if you've ever listened to music by Johann Sebastian Bach, you hear similarities in all of his pieces. If you look at different things painted by the artist Van Gogh, they all have certain similarities in them. You recognize his work based on the different qualities that it has. If you look at buildings by the architect Frank Lloyd Wright, all of his buildings have a lot of the same characteristics in them. So if God made all of the creatures, wouldn't those creatures have similar features in them? I mean, after all, if you have a good design, you're going to adapt it and reuse it in your next project. But I digress. As you've already learned, the DNA that makes these similar structures isn't passed through the same genes, so it can't be evidence of a common ancestor. And so when evolutionists couldn't find evidence of evolution in comparing large structures, then they started comparing molecules instead. One example is hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is what is in your red blood cells, and it carries oxygen. Hemoglobin is found in almost all vertebrates, almost all animals with a backbone. You'll find it in some annelids, which is what earthworms are part of. You'll find it in some echinoderms, which are starfish. You'll find it in some mollusks, which is the group that clams are in. You'll find it in some arthropods, which are where the insects are. You'll find it in some bacteria, but you don't find it in all of them, all across the board. But in every time that we find this hemoglobin, it's the same kind of molecule in each one. It's fully formed, it's fully functional, it's the same 8 helix folded protein. How did that evolve without being carried into all the species? Did it evolve numerous times and end up with the same form in all of those different creatures? Along with structural homology, there was also a set of studies called structural embryology, and you may see the word embryo within the word embryology there. In 1874, there was a German professor of zoology, Haeckel, and he drew a set of 24 drawings. There were 8 different embryos from 8 different types of creatures in 3 different stages of development. And you can actually see what these drawings look like in the image that I gave you for this video in that document. So if you don't have that, you'll need to pull that back out. These are a set of drawings where he claimed that the embryos look like the adult forms of their evolutionary forebears, is what he said. And so basically what he's trying to say is that evolution is, you can see it in embryonic development. So basically embryonic development is a rerun of evolution. And he claimed that every embryo goes through a fish, an amphibian, and a reptile stage. Now, as soon as this came out, scientists immediately rejected these drawings. They said, and Haeckel admitted that he had done this. He doctored the images. He introduced fabrications in them to emphasize what he wanted to emphasize. He left certain things out. He made other things bigger so that all of these embryos looked incredibly similar to each other. Even though it was immediately rejected as a hoax, even though the artist admitted that he had doctored these images to try to prove his point, these images have continued to occur in textbooks, in biology textbooks, and in literature for even up until the present day. Even in 1997, which I know to you guys probably seems like a long time ago, but it's really not that long ago. In 1997, there were still at least 50 biology textbooks that still contained these drawings. And in 2002, there was a Time magazine article that claimed that a human embryo at 40 days looks no different from a chick or an elephant or any other kind of an embryo. A 2010 biology book, and that's just 12 years ago from the day that I'm making this video. A 2010 biology book compared the developmental stages of an embryo to prove that we all came from a common ancestor. So it's still out there. It's still in biology books. It's in a book that I have. The pictures aren't exactly the same as these, but they still have pictures that try to show that, look, all these embryos are basically the same. We all have the same evolutionary ancestors. Now, believe it or not, this is where the abortion argument started from, because the abortion argument says a human embryo isn't human. They used to tell pregnant young women, oh, that thing that's growing inside of you, it's really a lot more like a fish. It's not a human. And even today, you're still going to hear that what women are carrying in the early stages of their pregnancy isn't human. And this is where that idea started from. It's called the recapitulation theory. And the most common argument against it is that supposedly these embryos have what are called gill slits. And they say even human embryos have gill slits. Well, what they are labeling as gill slits in a human embryo are not anything like gills, and they aren't even slits. All they are is folds of tissue. They don't have any function or structure that remotely resembles gills, and they have nothing to do with lungs. A human embryo never absorbs oxygen from water just like fish do. So don't be fooled by these drawings that are still popping up. They were a fraud when they're drawn, and they're still a fraud today.